Ho il piacere di presentare, posso? Vado? Karin SCHEPER, dirige il laboratorio di conservazione e restauro della Biblioteca Universitaria di Leida, dove da molti anni concentra il suo lavoro di conservazione e gli studi di archeologia del libro sulle ricche collezioni orientali. Ha conseguito un dottorato di ricerca sull'argomento nel 2014 e ha pubblicato una serie di articoli sulla materialità dei manoscritti del mondo islamico. Insegna, accoglie stagisti e tiene seminari su questa tradizione manoscritta. Un argomento correlato di suo interesse è la terminologia ed è coautrice di una terminologia illustrata online per la conservazione e la descrizione dei manoscritti islamici. E oggi ci presenta una relazione dal titolo Understanding Manuscript Structures and Bindings from the Islamic Lens, Examination, Exchange and Eventually Progress. Thank you. Please.
Yes, thank you, and very much also for organizing this event and including the Islamic manuscript bindings and structures. It is still a very young field, and therefore with this title I also try to express the fact that this is a field and a knowledge in progress. In this manuscript painting we see a class, a teacher, Sayyid Hakim, and his students, and also various aspects of the Islamic book culture. And it is therefore a good place to start this talk. With the question too of how do we learn? How do we know what we know, and how do we know that our knowledge is correct? Or how do we know when to question something that we thought we knew or understood? We all have our formal training, and then after that we learn much more in our conservation practice, and we learn to contextualize or apply the theory that we read or had been taught. And in doing so, we may come across objects that do not match the textbook descriptions, or we may follow guidelines that are not so successful as we expected. And that is exactly what happened to me when I started working with the Arabic manuscript collection in Leiden University Library. And that experience resulted in a long, but also rather joyful path of learning. Now, a few words about the collection may be useful, as I don't expect everybody to know that Leiden University is the oldest university of the Netherlands, though compared to a country such as Italy, our universities are relatively young. Leiden University was founded in 1575, and the library's collection, you can see it depicted here in 1610, contained Middle Eastern items early on. The Oriental manuscripts were first kept in this cabinet, so you can see that's small, but as the only Dutch university with a strong focus on Oriental studies, the number of items increased rapidly. When I started a conservation workshop in the library in 2000, the Middle Eastern manuscript collection comprised around 6,500 manuscripts. Many of those had first been in private collections of scholars of the 16th and 17th century and were then purchased by the library. In later centuries, many items also reached the library through contacts established by diplomats and through trade. Now, that was going too quickly. You missed this one, perhaps. Southeast Asia is also a region of importance in the Islamic world, and with the East Indian Company starting in 1602, the Dutch presence in the East lasted centuries, and Leiden has a large collection from Indonesia. Not all these manuscripts are paper documents or books. So here you can see a few other items, and not all of them are in the Arabic script or language either. We find bark and palm leaf and bamboo, to name just a few. But in my work and studies, I've always focused on the book and its structure and binding. So I'm taking you to the next examples of a few of the manuscripts that I treated in my early years in Leiden. And it may be good to explain the situation at the time. The library did not have a conservation studio when I arrived. There had been ad hoc treatments of objects in the decades before 2000 by conservators in private practice, yet never on a large scale. When I set up the studio, I had about 5 years of work experience and a fairly solid training, but all in Western book conservation. So these manuscripts from the Middle East and Indonesia were, to me, unknown territory. But they do not seem as exotic to us as books from the Far East, don't they? The substance and quality of the paper is much closer to European paper, which isn't very strange when you realize that the Arabs brought the technique of papermaking to Europe. And the functionality, format and materials of the books is also not that different. Again, this probably is a logical result of both book traditions having emerged in the Levant based on the same initial development of the Coptic Codex. So I treaded carefully, but I didn't feel too uncomfortable while I tried to catch up with the literature. And this is when I first became aware that some of the things written about the physical properties of the Islamic manuscripts was not correct, and that some of the treatment suggestions did not actually work so well for these objects, or they were too interventive and interfered with the object's material, historic information. The most important misunderstanding for me was that the structure with the flat spine, because Islamic manuscripts have an unsupported link stitch sewing and the lining material and leather spine of the binding are adhered directly onto the text block spine, was thought to cause problems and damage, and the supposed solution was to change the structure into a hollow spine using Western bookbinding methods. Now, I have carried out a few such treatments in my first years in Leiden, but I soon learned that it was very dissatisfactory and unnecessary. And I've talked about this at an IADA conference that had lessons learned as a theme more or less 10 years ago, and I won't go into this further now. I also don't want to talk too much about the actual structure of the Islamic book. Many of you may be well aware, and otherwise it is not so difficult to find much more information about the material characteristics of this bookbinding tradition. To sum up, the predominant structure has an unsupported link stitch sewing structure using only 2 stations, and the text block spine is lined from head to tail with either leather or textile, and then a primary end bend sewing connects all the gatherings and that spine lining material. The interesting thing perhaps is that these binding components as they are were known in the 1980s and the 1990s, but the structure as a whole and the manner in which the binding was attached to the text block was not well understood. And that too is not so strange, given the fact that most of the Islamic manuscripts studied belonged to Western institutions, and the objects were often severely damaged, or they had already seen a treatment or rebinding campaign based on Western model. In Leiden, however, I had access to many manuscripts that still had original structures that represented the bookbinding tradition as it had developed over many centuries and across the Islamic lands. So I started the survey of the material and technical features of these bindings to better understand them, and therefore to better be able to come up with a conservation solution that would actually serve these manuscripts. Now, some of the initial findings were, I thought, really exciting. There was strong evidence that bookbinders developed a method of sewing that they could use when they had to repair and rebind a manuscript. Instead of carrying out many paper repairs in the spine folds and apply the traditional unsupported sewing structure on 2 stations, they could use a link stitch sewing on 4 stations that then bypassed the somewhat damaged parts of the paper. And you can recognize this by the 2 passings of thread inside the gathering instead of 1. And this, of course, is also useful information for scholars working with these manuscripts, because then they know they are not working with the original structure. The original sewing stations are located somewhere in the middle of these sewing threads. And when damage also provides access to the text block spine, you can see the new thread passing between the second and the third station on the spine side. So here indicated with the middle black arrow. Another divergent sewing pattern I found in Indonesian manuscripts. And these manuscripts are consistently sewn with an unsupported link stitch on multiple stations. They therefore are very similar to most Coptic manuscripts, so I try to avoid the terminological issue here. But if you think of the link stitch sewing on multiple stations and the thread is found from head to tail between those stations, then you have actually this. And this is interesting and probably important because we don't know how we find that specific structure so far into Asia, while in the middle, in the Islamic world, we don't see how this could have developed from the simple link stitch station onto sewing on two stations only. Indonesian manuscripts appear to have more distinctive elements. For example, the manner in which the endbands were made. Now here we are not looking at Indonesian endbands. These are found in the rest of the Islamic world. So there we have a primary endband. It would be sewn over a leather core. And the secondary endband pattern was formed by two colors of thread. Usually this would form a chevron pattern, though several distinctively different patterns can be found. The way in which the threads are twined and passed the tie-downs defines the pattern, which can result in a diagonal or vertical stripe, or a checkered pattern, or one that I've called a diamond pattern. Now, Indonesian endbands are based on the same principle, a simple primary endband with tie-downs in each gathering, and a secondary endband that gives more structure to the endband, and usually consists of a chevron pattern. However, more often than not, are these patterns sewn with 3 or even 4 colors. And that may seem a small digression from the tradition as found in the heartland, but technically this is a huge development because it necessitates the use of more needles, 1 for each color, while the 2-color version only requires 1 needle. And the twining too is a lot more complicated. Moreover, the core of the endband is only rarely made of leather. Instead, we find vegetal material, like pieces of bamboo or reed, or a small bundle of patterned fabric. This, again, was a bit too quick, so I first wanted to point out this. It is also striking that this fabric strips could be used as decorative tufts on the sides of the endband. Alternatively, the secondary endband threads could be used to create these frills, and that is a characteristic only found in Indonesian manuscripts. Sometimes, of course, I found features that were difficult to explain. A good example is a sewing structure that involves the use of 1 sewing support only. From a technical point of view, this type is difficult to explain. How does it fit within the scope of methods between the East and the West? In Leiden, only 1 example has been identified, and you see that here. But this is where the exchange from the title comes in. Presentations like these, and teaching or giving workshops, always pays off in several ways. In this case, I've learned that in the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin, another specimen of this sewing structure is preserved. And during a work visit to examine the Islamic manuscripts in the Royal Collection in Windsor, I was able to identify a 3rd specimen. We are still in the dark as to why and when this type developed, but at least we now know that this was not an incidental occurrence. Other ways to increase our understanding I try to establish through working with students who are often interested in unresolved questions. And we have a few of those when we're talking about block-printed leather doublures that can be found in Islamic manuscripts from the 13th to 15th century. How and by whom were they made? We think that wooden blocks were used, similar to the ones used for block-printed fabrics. However, when I visited the David collection in Copenhagen, I photographed this stone matrix and a leather pouch with intaglio printing, and that, of course, then offers an additional possibility. From a conservation perspective, the discoloration this block-printed leather causes in the adjacent paper has interested me too. Does the discoloration signify deterioration? Was a particular agent or dye used when the leather was decorated? And is that causing the discoloration? In terms of book historical research, this phenomenon can actually be very helpful. I am currently involved in a project that studies the dispersed collection of the historic library of the mosque in Acre, or Akka, Palestine. And out of necessity, a large part of this research has to happen with digital images. The discoloration patterns of the block-printed leather doublures are so distinct that even from digital access, it is possible to identify their former presence, so even when those leather doublures themselves are gone. In this example, we see a manuscript with a very recent rebinding. But the original fly-leaves, however, make it possible to establish that once this manuscript had a Mamluk binding, and that of course says something about the date of the manuscript too, and it may have looked perhaps like one of these examples. The student who decided to take on this topic for a diagnostic study, Luca van der Zande, took the topic a little further. I had identified the items with the leather doublures, and Luca compared the patterns. And he found two unrelated manuscripts with the same pattern, and that of course poses the question, could this mean that the manuscripts were bound in the same bookbinding workshop, or were the decorated skins bought from the same block printing workshop and then used by different bookbinders? We also addressed, so I'm just giving you the questions, I don't have answers yet. But we did address another question as well. It has been stated that these leather doublures were printed in situ, so after the leather was applied as a doublure. Practically, this seems unlikely to me, but the material evidence makes a stronger argument. And already in this image, we can see a slightly different angle in the printed patterns, right? So when Luca looked into the size of the blocks used, so I hope you can see it, yeah, the red lines are clear enough. So when Luca looked into the size of the blocks, or the repetitive entity of the patterns, he found even more convincing evidence. When a craftsperson applies a printing block, it seems sensible that he or she starts at one side or edge, and then proceeds from there. When this process would be carried out in situ on the interior of a binding, you would certainly expect the pattern to be aligned with the sides of the board. The situation, as in this picture on the right, certainly indicates that this doublure was not printed in situ. It suggests that a larger piece of decorated leather was cut to size, not minding the exact position of the blocks, the pattern, and then adhered to the inside of the board. We found more evidence for the theory that these doublures were printed prior to application. Some of the leather doublures appear to have small repair patches, where the patterns discontinued, though they were cut from the same larger patterned skin. Other doublures with stubs crossing the inner joint and pasted onto the inner margin of the outer text block leaves also had patterns, stamps onto this decoratively cut stubbed extension. And that would be a very hard thing to do in situ without damaging the construction. Even though such research projects are limited in scope and involve only a small group of manuscripts, the information gained is useful and helps us to understand the practice of the craftsmen involved. From an international digitization project in which Leiden participated, I learned that a focused study also helps to increase our knowledge. In this case, a condition survey was needed of all the manuscripts in Yemen in the Leiden collection, around 200 items. Looking at so many Yemeni manuscripts sequentially, I observed things that I had not seen before. It taught me that a comparative study of manuscripts from one specific region could be a next step forward. For example, I noticed that some of these bindings had a hole punched in the pointed end of the envelope flap, and some bindings even had a remnant of a leather lace in that spot. First of all, this indicates that the bindings closed in a different way than the large majority. The envelope flap usually closes under the front or right board. In order to use the strap as a wraparound strap, the flap obviously needs to close over the board. This then felt similar to the way many loose-leaf manuscripts from sub-Saharan Africa are protected by a leather wrapper binding tied with a leather strap, such as depicted here on the right. Looking at the map and the history of the region, it is clear that the exchanges between the south of the Arabian Peninsula and Africa were frequent and continued over a long period of time, which can explain the blending of traditions. Another feature that became noticeable was the lack of gold in Yemeni manuscripts and their bindings. So bindings usually are decorated by blind tooling or paper-cut ornaments, and that can be done with colored paper and very delicately cut, and others are decorated with some rougher decorated elements, you could say. And when you look at the texts, they are embellished with many colors, but gold appeared to be absent, whereas it is common enough in the rest of the Islamic world. This observation tied in with a research project I had been involved with just a year or so before. Anne Regour, a scholar specialized in manuscript culture in Yemen, had asked me about the glistening particles she had observed in quite a few of the manuscripts in Leiden. So I hope you can also see it, the image on the left, the colophon has these glimmering particles. Yeah, you can see it good. So this resulted in a project in which the particles were analyzed. And we found mica and metal shavings, but not gold, crushed shell, and also colored sand. Yes, so here you can see Anne Regour as well. The particles would have been shaken over the text while the ink was still moist, so that the particles were embedded in the ink surface. It was obvious that this practice meant that the copyist wanted to highlight certain words or parts of the text, such as a colophon or chapter headings or an opening page. While working on this project, however, I had not noted the total absence of gold. It was only through working with the complete collection of the manuscripts from Yemen, so the larger focused survey, that the penny dropped for me. And since the use of gold is prohibited in certain branches of Islam, these sparkling elements may have been the copyist's solution to still be able to highlight certain words. Many Islamic book collections are yet to be studied, and that may be especially helpful to extend our knowledge of regional specific practices, so we need to spread the surveys and the studies that we are going to conduct. And as Nicholas Pickwood reminded us yesterday, we need to see thousands of manuscripts in order to understand certain developments, so there's really still a lot of work to be done. But I do find it exciting that after working with these collections in Leiden for more than 20 years now, I'm still learning from the books themselves. And sometimes things become only apparent when exchanging observations with others and having to think about questions prompted by students. So the only way forward is to study and to share what we know. And I like to express my special thanks to all the students that have visited the conservation workshop in Leiden, have worked with me and have asked all these questions, or people that I met in workshops. And I also like to thank you for listening.
Grazie, thank you. Apro la discussione. Domande?
Thank you for the presentation. It's really amazing material. And I'm thinking out loud now. So I wasn't really, I didn't know that that kind of chain stitch was existing, the one you showed that just drops down and links to the previous one. And are these manuscripts dated, the binding are dated? Maybe you said, but...
No, I didn't say, but this is the structure that you would find throughout the manuscript tradition in the Islamic world. And of course, the oldest ones have not been preserved in the original bindings, but certainly from the 11th, 12th century onwards, it's very certain that this is the structure that was used.
I see.
Yeah. And it is so logical, right? Because it's exactly the same area of the world where it is developed. So Coptic.
Yeah, exactly. I was thinking about that.
And the neighboring book traditions have very close ties. And I think what is so interesting is that all of these cultural differences do appear to have a meaning, because it also, the books therefore also say, but we are actually part of this culture.
Yeah.
Yes. So for example, when you, so I've also seen manuscripts from the Middle East that belong to the Christian Arabic community.
Yeah.
So it's not Coptic, it's not the Islamic community, it's the Christian Arabic community. They used the chain stitch sewing structure over 3 stations. So that within itself is it's a sort of compact Coptic sewing, if you would like to say that. And it's divergent from the Islamic one. And the thing that we don't know, of course, is whether these bookbinding workshops were really very separate and didn't want to mingle, or how this exactly developed and was established, we don't know, but it's clear that this is the case. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. It's really interesting. Thank you. I will think about it more.
Yeah.
Thank you. Beautifully presented and very, very interesting. And I just thought whether you've talked to George Boudalis about one of the binders recorded at St. Catherine's Monastery, who was born in Syria and could bind, and said that he could bind in both the Islamic and the Christian manner. He could do either, according to what he was asked to do. And also the Christian Arab manuscripts at St. Catherine's, which are, as with all the Greek manuscripts, have unsupported sewing structures, but they're finished off as Greek bindings. So they're very much within the Greek end of the tradition rather than the Coptic end of the tradition, if you like.
Yes.
And that's just one collection, so it's not an example for everywhere.
No.
But the other point I just wanted to make is the unsupported sewing structure was used in Western Europe all the way through, but it's lost. We don't know very much about it. You find it in archival volumes, you find it in some printed books, and then it reappears in the 18th century for livres en brochure in France. Thousands of them sewn with unsupported sewing structure. So the structure is around, sort of floating around the Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean, and it gets picked up and dropped and used in different ways. It's a fascinating study, which we hardly know anything about.
Well, I thank you for mentioning that, because indeed it would actually be good to stress that a little bit more, because I also think that that might help to re-establish a certain appreciation for the unsupported link-stick sewing structures in other cultures, because they've been tended to devalued in a certain way.
Yes.
But then when we do realize again that this was actually also part of what was made in Europe, that may create a different view.
There was
on
a conference at the the National Archives very recently online, which I listened to it online, showing 14th or 13th century archival volumes from England with unsupported sewing structures, which we don't know of from the library tradition, but that they are in the archival world. I think there's something to learn from that too.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation and for sharing these pictures, which are so inspiring. So I was wondering if you noticed some kind of decay of the specks which were added on the inks, the shimmering specks. So decay like oxidation, which may maybe suggest that they derived from pyrite, for example, or silver, something like that. Because those specks remember me of some additions which I found on the varnishes which were used on the Venetian Sank panel bindings that I'm studying. So,
okay.
Thank you.
It is an interesting question, but perhaps difficult to answer because so the shell wouldn't have degraded, I suppose, and the mica also not, and for the colored sand, it's difficult to say because I don't know what the starting point of that color was, but I suppose it's probably still quite similar to what it was, so we would have to look at the metal little bits, and there's one manuscript that has very distinct blackish still sparkling, but not so much. So perhaps that used to be more silvery, but with my equipment, and there's nothing else really that I can say. I can say that the paper is not deteriorated, and from a preservation point of view, the largest risk is that these particles are removed. So when a manuscript would be dry cleaned, or when it would be digitized with a glass plate on top of it, I mean, the surface, of course, is easily disturbed. So sometimes we found more particles already in the middle of the spine folds and not actually on the ink so much, yes.
That's really interesting because the presence of particles in the varnishes, it's a known, I mean, in the varnish of Islamic bindings, it's reported in the literature, but then I didn't know about the inks with particles embedded in it. Okay, thank you.
Altre domande? Bene, grazie.